How can we practice obedience and self-control with our children?
So as we talked about previously, an objective standard of obedience means that both parents and children know what obedience looks like. And we think this is best accomplished by overtly teaching what obedience is and then practicing together and doing this fairly frequently. This can actually be fun. It may not sound like it, but it really is. Some of our children really looked forward to what we called training time. And it was not uncommon to see smiling faces and hear giggles during this practice session. Although you do probably have to be ready to deal with hard hearts, at least initially when you first start training time or some practice sessions. But after teaching that obedience means that something must be done completely right away with a cheerful attitude, then John and I would role play this with the children. So perhaps I would ask John, who was pretending to be the child at that moment, to pick up the toys in the living room. And the first time he said, "Yes, Mommy," with gusto, but then dawdled and got distracted and didn't do it very promptly. So then we would ask the children seated on the couch, what about this was or wasn't obedience? And the children would correctly identify that he didn't do it right away. So then we would act out another scenario where I would ask John to pick up the toys in the living room, and he would say, "Yes, Mommy," with a really whiny voice, and then stomp around while picking up the toys. And the children would successfully identify that he wasn't doing it with a cheerful spirit in submission to authority. So after he and I would demonstrate several scenarios of what obedience doesn't look like, and at least one or more scenarios of what obedience does look like, then we would have each child practice. With really little ones, you might just ask them to sit down and fold their hands in their laps, because that might be enough for a toddler, right? Just, can you do that right in this moment? Or maybe ask them to go hug a sibling, because they usually think that's really fun. But with older children, we might like to make it a little tricky and ask them to do 3 or 4 things in sequence. Put this pillow over there, clap 3 times, turn around and hug the baby, and just, "Yes, Mommy," and then they run off to do those things. They tended to love that challenge. So I would definitely recommend practicing what obedience is and what it looks like, and making sure the children know that they know what it is and they can do it, and that gives them less of an easy out to pretend that they don't know sometime in the future. Similarly, I think self-control is it's a skill basically that needs to be taught and also practiced. None of us are born with self-control. We have to learn to control our bodies. And this is important, even as adults. It requires self-control to obey the Lord. I think of Proverbs 16:32, which says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." We want to equip our children to rule their spirits and not be ruled by every whim of emotion or thought that goes through their heads. As I was thinking about this podcast, I was reading an excerpt in the book Stepping Heavenward by Elizabeth Prentice. And she said this about children. It's 2 short sentences, but I thought just nailed this topic on the head. How can they yield to God who have never been taught to yield to human authority? And how well fitted will they be to rule their own households who have never learned to rule themselves? I was just like, amen, exactly. That's exactly what we're getting at. I think a good way to practice self-control with little ones is to teach them to be able to sit still. That may sound really overwhelming and difficult, but I do believe it's possible. And this is a huge blessing to not only you, the parents, but to those around them at church, in doctor's offices, at concerts. It's amazing how apparently this is an unknown skill, because I feel like if my children were with me in a doctor's office and there were 5, 6, 7 of them sitting next to me, sitting reasonably still, a lot of people would walk by and make amazing comments. I was like, they're just sitting, it's not that hard, but apparently it is that hard. But it's a skill that needs to be taught. I don't think children are going to naturally do that if they haven't been taught how to do that. So you can start small with having them sit on a small chair their size or sit on the couch near you while at home, preferably when they're well rested and recently fed, so that they have a good chance of being able to do this with a happy heart. And ask them to sit still and fold their hands so that they're not using their hands to distract themselves or others. You can start with just a few minutes at a time. Set a timer and say, we're going to see if you can do this for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or something really tiny. And then each day you can practice self-control by challenging them to see if they can sit for 1 or 2 minutes more than the day before. And if you're diligent to practice that, it won't take long before both they and you know that they are actually able to sit quietly without disturbing others with their hands or bodies for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes. And then you can ask them to exercise this skill when at a doctor's office or church service, during a sermon, or at a concert. And then you can legitimately praise them for exercising this skill. You can call grandma and grandpa, aunts and uncles, and tell them how wonderful it is that your child can bless others by controlling their bodies that way. You can thank them for being a blessing to those around them by not distracting with their bodies. I think some children are going to have a much harder time with this than others and will require more patience. They're just wired to wiggle. But maybe you can teach them just to wiggle their foot in a way that won't distract other people and still be getting at the general principle of ruling their bodies and their spirits.